Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. Today I will review a video by Epimetheus called The Byzantine Army, Dark to Golden Age. My intention is to go through this 11-minute video and point out everything that he gets correct and explain what is incorrect or at least only partially true. Firstly, my aim is not to lampoon him or his work, but to primarily enhance our knowledge. First, I would like to praise his maps as they are very well drawn and his use of visuals is by far better than mine. The map of the Eastern Roman Empire that he uses for most of the video is a pretty accurate one. For the early 8th century, its borders roughly look like this. Anatolia is where most of the possessions were. They held the Crimea, pieces of the Balkans, and a few pieces of Italy and the western Mediterranean islands, although Sardinia and Corsica were barely under Roman control at this point. He then talks about how the Bulgars had formed an empire and heavily defeated the Romans, implying the defeat at Pliska in 811, with the death of Nicephorus I. Then he explains the other main enemies of the empire being the Lombards and the Umayyad Caliphate. It should be noted that in 750 the Umayyads were kicked out and replaced by the Abbasids. He then mentions that Italy was largely autonomous and the Pope provided the main leadership. He does not mention, however, the 2,000 soldiers of the Theme of Sicily or the Exarch of Ravenna, who was in supreme command of the civil and military operations of Italy. The Pope was largely involved in defending Rome. Epimetheus then tells us about the endless civil wars and revolts in the 7th and 8th century and correctly identifies them as the Byzantines' biggest weakness during this time. He then says that this Byzantine Dark Age saw a breakdown in the ability of the central government to collect taxes and pay the troops, which motivated many soldiers to turn to banditry and rebellion. There are some issues with this statement. The failure of the government to pay its troops due to an erratic collection of taxes applies most ostensibly to the first half of the 7th century. This was because of a combination of civil wars, foreign invasions, massive losses in territory, and, most importantly of all, the Black Death had wiped out over a fifth of the population of the empire. Evidence from the 7th century shows the money used in the provinces was massively reduced from earlier periods, but importantly did not totally collapse. At no point in the whole history of the Eastern Roman Empire did the central government in Constantinople fail to collect taxes. However, it did find ways to reduce the amount of money that was burdened on the fisc, such as granting soldiers land, so that they could support themselves and reduce salaries to public servants such as bureaucrats and soldiers. The government's failure to pay its troops ceased to be a major issue after it reduced its state expenses during the reign of Constans II from 3,707,000 solidi to 2,027,000 solidi. The main reason for military unrest in the 7th century was personal ambition, as seen in the revolts of Saborius, Mezisius, and Tiberius III, for instance. The unrest in the army that Epimetheus describes applies far more to the 6th rather than the 7th or even 8th centuries. He then says that emperors often came to power promising increased or any pay to the army and were often removed when unable to deliver. Although Maurice's death was because of his parsimony towards the army, surely the same would have been true for Heraclius, who cut the army's pay by half and used debased silver hexagram coins instead of gold, so that the money they were paid was worth less. I believe Epimetheus' explanation of this again applies far more to the 6th century than the 7th, or at least until after 641 AD. Most rebellions in the later 7th and 8th centuries were due to dissatisfaction with those in charge, be that an emperor, like Constans II, or Justinian II, or the people around them, like the Empress Martina, or for personal ambition, such as Arthabasdos. Other reasons for military unrest were religious, for example the split between the Monothelites and the Chalcedonians. At no point, after 641, and for the rest of the period that Epimetheus describes, do usurpers promise their troops more money or payment of arrears. Neither was an emperor removed because he failed to deliver, as he says. Epimetheus continues, and correctly says that the Romans adapted when faced with impossible difficulties, and survived. Following on, he says the Eastern Romans of the 7th and 8th centuries were primarily motivated in motivating their unpaid armies to stop rebellion and restore order. As I feel I have covered in sufficient detail why the former statement is incorrect, I shall instead cover the latter. This is correct that the Romans strove for greater stability and security. The proliferation of more strategia, the introduction of the tagmata, the securing of the Anatolian frontier, and introduction of laws such as the Farmers' Law, the Rhodian Sea Laws, and the Ecclesia by Leo III were all steps towards restoring order and, indeed, recovery. These measures were effective because it did reduce the frequency of rebellions in the 8th and 9th centuries, the tumultuous years after the end of the Isaurian dynasty aside, and also they revived the military, economic and demographic competence of the empire. Learning saw a comeback in the 8th century too. He then talks about the late Roman army. For more than 300 years, the Romans had used an effective system relying on mobile field armies, reacting to enemy incursions that were formidable enough to make it through a screen of defensive, fortified garrisons. He also gives the names for the garrison troops as Limitani by the border, Ripenses by the riverbank, and for the field army, Comitatenses, which he does not mention were the new standard regiments of legionaries after Diocletian. He also mentions the Palatini, meaning the elite. The Palatinae were regiments like the Joviani and the Schollae. Epimetheus correctly identifies in brief the strategy of the late Roman military. He continues, the Danube River and the deserts that had formed Rome's naturally defensive borders had been overrun. Raids from the Bulgarian Empire and Slavic tribes in the west and Arabs in the east, coupled with the grain supply being cut off from Egypt, caused widespread famine, depopulation, and a migration towards the centre of Roman territory. Epimetheus is half right here. The Slavs settled rather than raided the Eastern Roman Empire, forming Sclavonia, or small confederations of Slavs that settled all over Greece, Macedonia, and Thrace. The Bulgarians did raid, but had a far more dynamic relationship with the Romans than the Avars, whom Epimetheus never mentions. The grain supply of Egypt did not cause famine. I have looked at the primary sources, and as far as I am aware, there is no mention of famine in the 460s as a result of the cutting off of the grain supply from Egypt. Firstly, the grain from Egypt was largely used for the grain dole, which did end after the Sassanid conquest in 618. However, Africa, which the empire held until 698, continued to supply grain to the rest of the empire, mitigating any substantial loss of food. Epimetheus again does not mention the plague, which continued to recur into the mid-8th century, but he is correct about migrations away from the frontiers by civilians, although he does not mention that these centres were largely around the Aegean Sea in Asia Minor, or the decline of large cities into fortified towns and villages. Moving on, he says, the new system that emerged from the near-complete breakdown of the old reorganised the empire into themes. The theme was originally a largely self-reliant military district. This is correct. Each Fermata was led by a strategos, who became a very powerful military and political figure due to the high-level autonomy they were given. The strategoi had previously been the generals of mobile field armies, but now had judicial power in the civilian world, as well as administrative power in the military. This is correct, but this happened over time as the late imperial administration morphed into the theme system as known in later centuries. Many of these administrative changes occurred during the late 8th century rather than straight after Constans II's creation of the themes. Continuing on, with most of the earlier provincial dioceses being reorganised in the themes roughly between the years 650 and 750, each soldier within a theme was typically tied to a piece of food-producing land, and are sometimes referred to as farmer soldiers, but it is perhaps more accurate to view these arrangements as a form of semi-feudalism, where the peasant farmers of the land were obliged to feed and equip a soldier, in a similar manner to a medieval knight. Here Epimetheus gets a little anachronistic, and a little wrong. The Fermatic soldiers were not tied to the land, they owned it. Much of these lands were probably given to soldiers from the imperial estates and wealthy landowners. These lands were not leased. The Fermata, as farmer soldiers, is correct because the expectation was that soldiers would use their land to earn money to buy their equipment from the apotheki, warehouses run by the commerciarioi, in addition to their wages. Therefore, it would be wrong to view this arrangement as a form of semi-feudalism. The obligation of a village community to provision its soldiers on the muster roll was instituted by Nicolle in 809 to 810. Before this, the burden was generally taken up by the soldier's household. Continuing on, this led to a wider variety and less standardisation of equipment used, but the soldier did not own the land, and was merely leasing it from the emperor, and the land the soldier was tied to could be changed at the discretion of his superiors. He is right that standardisation fell away, but, as explained, his second point is wrong as the soldiers owned their own land. Emperors did resettle people, which is different. For instance, when Nicolle I resettled people from Anatolia to Greece, they had to sell their land, but gained ownership over the new land they were moved to. Continuing, the status and security the new system provided for the soldiers alleviated some of the threat that unpaid soldiers posed, but it did create new problems. Byzantine soldiers, after Heraclius, were paid 5 nomismata per year, with officers being paid a bit more. Moving on. The looting and anarchy had ended, but was replaced by more organised revolts led by the strategos of the themes, which quickly developed antagonistic relationships not only with the capital of Constantinople, but with each other. As the themes developed, very individual senses of identity and rivalry, and disdain for each other. Epimetheus is correct about the themes gaining a distinct identity and loyalties, seen clearly in the civil war between Artabasdos and Constantine V, where different themes took the sides of different emperors. The rest is a little confused. Were revolts before the creation of the themes any less well organised than those afterwards? In fact, they became more frequent until Constantine V. The map Epimetheus uses shows the Anatolian themes in 750 AD. This map I have seen on Wikipedia and is a bit wrong. Here is a map which is more accurate for the time and depicts and includes the other regions and not just Anatolia. In response, the central government began 3 long-term strategies to mitigate the problems the themes had created. The problem was not so much the individual soldier, but the strategoi, so the themes were slowly broken up over time into smaller themes. This is correct. Here he shows another map of the themes, and Kleisure of Anatolia. This map is from the 9th century, and again is based on the one in Wikipedia. Here is a more accurate one from the same period. He then mentions that the number of strategoi increased, which reduced their individual power, which is accurate, and we do see a decrease in the number of thematic revolts. He also says that a strategos' judicial power over the civilian world within their theme was stripped, and that power was given to a new bureaucrat who was assigned to each theme. This is not quite true. The praetor, most likely the bureaucrat referred to by Epimetheus, still continued his judicial role well into the 9th century, after which his name changed to the akrite, or judges. They were one of the officers under the strategos, but the strategos remained his superior. In addition, many other officials were added to the staff of the strategos as their role included more and more of the civic responsibilities of the province, as well as the military, including the Anthipatos, Protonotorios, Scalarios, Sacalarios, and many more that looked after administration, finances, recruitment, and so on. He then says, second, the emperor's units of Palatini were reformed into the Tagmata armies, centrally based in and around the capital of Constantinople, and were greatly increased in number over time as the size of the Fermata armies was decreased. This is partly true, though perhaps poorly explained. The two praesentale armies, the armies in the emperor's presence, form the Opsikion theme. The Tagmata were created out of this theme, as well as the theme of Thrace, and a new theme was created called the Optimates, which they were also based from. This was about 100 years after the settlement of the Praesentales in a theme. The Tagmata were centred around Constantinople, Thrace, and Optimates. It is also true that their numbers increased from 18,000 when they were first formed to 28,000 during the reign of Leo VI. However, the Fermata army also increased from 62,000 to 96,000 from Constantine V to the time of Theophilus. The navy remained at around 35,000 sailors. The Tagmata did not grow at the expense of the Fermata. Unlike those armies, the Tagmata were always paid in cash and on time, and were personally loyal to the emperor. This is wrong. The Fermata, as well as the Tagmata, were paid in cash, and it is believed that the Tagmata owned land in Thrace, Optimates, and Constantinople, just as the Fermata did in the provinces. The Tagmata were the elite, and so he is right that these troops would be more loyal, but paying the troops on time rarely seems to have been a problem after the creation of the theme system. Continuing, each Tagmata, approximately numbering 4,000 men, was commanded by a domestikos. When established in 745, the Tagmata totaled around 18,000 men, steadily increasing to 42,000 over the next 2 centuries. When not personally led by the emperor into battle, the Tagmata were commanded by a senior domestikos. Another trend that continued throughout the Middle and later Byzantine history was the increased reliance on cavalry, especially the heavily armed cataphracts, which form the majority of the Tagmata. This is correct, although he does not mention that the walls and the Numera were 2,000-man infantry garrisons of Constantinople, along with a 2,000-man Optimates, which was a logistical corps, i.e. the baggage train. By the end of the 10th century, with the addition of more Tagmata for both East and West, the Immortals, a 4,000-man band, and the Varangrian Guard, roughly 6,000 men, the number of the Tagmata had significantly increased. He then says, the Empire restructured the way it recruited. Because of the Empire's drastic change in borders, and the fact that foreign, not Greek or Latin-speaking troops were even more likely to riot, pillage or revolt, when unpaid, it was necessary to recruit differently. It also might have something to do with the fact that the East massively limited its use of foederati, that is, foreign soldiers in Roman service. Zeno and Anastasius I introduced reforms that monitored army recruitment and made changes that produced enough volunteers to not rely on barbarians to fill up the ranks. This is why by the reign of Justinian I, most of the Roman army were Roman citizens again. Problems of Germanization having long since gone. Continuing. The army became smaller, shrinking from 270 to 340,000 men in AD 300 to 540 to 80 to 110 in the 7th and 10th centuries, with the majority of the army being recruited from central Anatolia. Although present in earlier times, hereditary recruitment became more widespread. Overall, the Eastern Romans wanted the infantry to be smaller in number, more native, more Christian, and more loyal, as well as for the thematic cavalry. Epimetheus is right about the hereditary nature of recruitment. This was a law since Diocletian, and after the creation of the themes, soldiers were registered on a muster roll. Soldiers on this register had to provide soldiers, and if they could not, taxes instead. After the vexations of Nicolle I, whole village communities became responsible for sending and supporting their fighting men. Epimetheus' numbers are a bit all over the place, unfortunately, and his explanation for the reduction in numbers is representative of this. The issue probably comes from his attempt to fit a single rough estimate to fit into two very long time periods for which things changed considerably. To break it down, for the 4th century, the Roman army has been estimated to be around 400,000 to 500,000 men by my reckoning. Then, in the 5th and 6th, it dropped to 150,000 roughly. From Justinian I to Constans II, the numbers had dropped to about 109,000 men. In the 8th century, it was 80,000, and then in the 9th, it leapt up to 140,000, and then in the 10th, to about 200,000. The numbers Epimetheus provides seems to be the numbers for the 6th century and the 8th and 9th century. It then says, however, this was not the case for the central Tegmatic armies, which maintained a large number of prestigious foreign units, some comprised entirely of units from far-off lands, such as sub-Saharan Africans or Scandinavians. This seems to be a reference to the Varangian Guard. They were formed in the late 10th century and continued until the empire's fall in 1453. After 1066, Englishmen became a considerable demographic in the Varangian Guard. It should be remembered that the Varangians were just one unit and were outnumbered by the other Tagmata. I am unaware of any use of sub-Saharan Africans in the Roman Tagmata. Particularly prized were Persian heavy cavalrymen and later Arabs. The Byzantines developed an elaborate ceremony for captured Arab troops that they wished to recruit. Upon arrival in Constantinople, they were given new clothes, chariot races, and treated to lavish banquets. The Romans even constructed a mosque for them in the city and were noted for their defense of the city walls in a Bulgar attempt to take Constantinople. There is much that is wrong with this passage. Firstly, what is correct is that foreigners, or at least their leaders, that were resettled in the empire, were given a show at Constantinople. However, Epimetheus may be confusing the Persian cataphracts with the Romans' adoption of their own cataphracts in this case. Indeed, he might also be talking about the Kuramites. This was a Persian group whose religion drew on aspects of Shia Islam and Zoroastrianism. However, they were not straight-up Muslims. They were resettled in the empire in large numbers during the reign of Theophanes. As to the Arabs, he might be referring to the settlement of the Mahdiites in the reign of Justinian II, the slit-nosed. This was a group of Syriac Christians, ancestors of the modern Maronite Christians of the Levant today. Arab Muslims were not settled in the empire in large numbers. I have also found no evidence of a mosque built in Constantinople except in the last decades of the empire's existence, in the 14th and 15th century. Usually these resettled groups and their faith were tolerated, or asked to convert to Orthodox Christianity, or voluntarily did so. For example, Diogenes of Crete was the son of an Arab that had converted from Islam to Christianity and had a Roman mother. That is to say, that some of the provincial troops could be quite diverse in their demographics. However, there was significant cultural exchange between the Arabs and Romans throughout this period. The attack on Constantinople by the Bulgars he refers to might be the Battle of Constantinople in 922, where the Roman troops, to my knowledge, do not seem to have had a special Arab contingent in it. He then says the Eastern Roman strategy during the Dark Age could be crudely summed up as survive and protect the capital. However, the sophisticated strategy of shadowing warfare was developed. The Taurus mountain range was the greatest natural defence the Romans had at their disposal. While not impregnable, the limited number of passes a large army could advance through made the potential paths of attack predictable. With an effective system of mountain-top beacons, accurate information on enemy troop movements could be conveyed. This is spot on. The Romans mitigated their losses and avoided the risk of pitched battles as much as possible. It was not really until the creation of the Tagmata that the army accomplished much more than punitive expeditions and raids. The system of watchposts was created by Leo the mathematician for Emperor Theophilus. There was a clock at Constantinople and near Tarsus. Each hour on the clock had a message on it rather than the time. At the corresponding time of day, a fire would be lit at the nearest frontier watchtower, and then a chain of 10 watchtowers would be lit, bringing the message back to Constantinople within an hour. These watchtowers would also keep local strategoi informed of enemy movements. He then says, the Byzantine generals of the Dark Age tried to avoid direct confrontation and preferred to limit the damage of an enemy attack rather than crushing it. They would track enemies from a distance and then try to attack their baggage train or cut off their supplies and harass them as they withdrew. This guerrilla warfare strategy proved effective and the Romans survived. Under the Macedonian dynasty, Byzantium experienced a golden age. After centuries of struggling for survival, and under the rule of some of their greatest emperors, empire took the fight to its adversaries. The emperors Basil, Leo, and Romanus successfully campaigned against the Arabs, and at sea, the Roman fleet, long inferior to that of the Arabs, decisively defeated the Arabs in the 10th century. Cyprus and Crete were firmly brought back within the empire. Although he misses out the role that the Isaurian and Amorian emperors and Nicephorus I played in the Eastern Roman revival in the late 8th and especially the 9th century. One of the technological achievements of the later Romans is known as Greek fire. This was shot from a variety of flamethrower-like devices and would ignite on contact with water. Greek fire was discovered during the reign of Constantine IV by Callinicus of Heliopolis. It did not ignite on contact with water. Its true strength was that it was not put out by water, which is why it was so effective at sea, as nothing could quench the flames. The formula, he says, for this weapon was a closely guarded state secret and proved an extremely effective weapon upon multiple occasions, and the Romans once again became the most powerful force in the Eastern Mediterranean. Two of the greatest Byzantine generals would later become emperors, and both campaigned deep into Abbasid territory and reconquered Syria. Nicephorus and John successfully campaigned against the Bulgars and Kievan Rus, but were unable to end the substantial Bulgar influence on the region. In the year 1001, a peace treaty was signed with the Arabs, allowing the Emperor Basil II to focus the empire's troops on Bulgaria. After a series of bloody and brilliant campaigns, he was able to reassert Roman dominance in the region. He then says, after Basil II's death, the empire went into steep decline, with a long series of weak emperors. After requesting assistance from the west, and unintentionally triggering a series of crusades that would prove disastrous for the Romans, the wayward Fourth Crusade attacked, captured, and looted Constantinople, destroying much of the city in 1204. The Eastern Roman Empire was left poor, smaller, and ultimately less able to defend itself effectively from the Turkish conquests in Anatolia that followed. One of the most lasting effects of the Crusades was the acceleration of the Eastern Romans' decline. The Eastern Roman Empire spent the last couple of centuries of its existence as a largely depopulated backwater, guarded by a small army largely comprised of mercenaries, until its final defeat in 1453, less than 40 years before Columbus would sail to the New World. And then he ends the video. To this conclusion, I would say that as a sketch, the devil is in the detail. He does not mention the Komnenian restoration, or the positive outcome of the First Crusade. He skips the recovery of Constantinople by the Nicaeans and the successors of Michael VIII, but more to the point, completely glosses over the development of the Roman army after 1081. It may have been better to remove this part from Epimetheus' video, since it's actually irrelevant to his topic. Altogether, I commend Epimetheus' video for attempting to come to grips with a vast period, based on sources that are hard to come by, and scholarship that is still, despite recent advances, in its infancy. Whereas Roman, 18th century or Napoleonic military history might have 8 books on their subject, Byzantine military history, by comparison, would have a book. Thus, despite my many corrections, it seems certainly not from a lack of trying, from Epimetheus. I have been your host, Daniel Maynard. I would like to thank Epimetheus for creating his video, and this has been Eastern Roman History.